Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, my name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the museum. And today you have the honor and privilege of listening to Erika Schwartz, a Holocaust survivor who will share her story with you. And afterwards, we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Before we begin, I'm going to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. But they did this at a time when most people were not yet willing to learn about the Holocaust, and as a result, many survivors were not yet willing to speak about their experiences. Thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We can't do the work that we do without our survivor community, who still educates our community on a regular basis and sharing their personal stories with us. And our museum is currently closed as we complete the final phase of construction of our Jonah Goldrich campus. But while we're closed, we're offering a variety of online programs, including Holocaust Survivor Talks approximately twice a month online, as well as in-person programs at Barnes & Noble at the Grove for those of you in Southern California. Please follow our website for more information about our programs online. And this is also a very special opportunity to be able to engage with some of members of our community, such as Erika Schwartz, who lives in Missouri now, but lived in Los Angeles area for many years and would speak at our museum. And we always so happy to have Erika come and speak at the museum when she's in Los Angeles. But now that we're doing this on Zoom, this is a great opportunity for everyone to listen to her story. Erika has spoken so frequently to students at our museum, and we're so honored to have her here today to share her story. And again, you'll be able to ask questions. I would also like to thank our ASL interpreter, Sherilyn King, for being with us today and providing ASL interpretation. Erika, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today and for listening to Erika's story.
Thank you, Michael. My story isn't exactly what you'd expect from a Holocaust survivor. I was just a year old when the war ended, so I have no personal memories of the atrocities. But my mother and I were the only survivors from our family, and the effect on my mother was profound. She was severely traumatized for life, unable to be a nurturing parent. So in addition to telling you how most of my family was murdered, you'll also learn about the legacy of trauma affecting my ability to function until well into my 40s. In addition, there were many other events completely beyond my control that added to the chaos of those years. This may all seem irrelevant at first, but when I'm done, you'll understand why it's such an important part of my story. My story begins in a Nazi ghetto in 1944 Hungary. I was marked for death from the moment of my birth. I was born Erika Hornstein on April 23, 1944, in the Nyíregyháza, Hungary ghetto. 2 weeks later, all of the women and children in my family were transported to Auschwitz to be murdered. Much of my life was ruled by my role as the child of a survivor. My mother was born in the town of Hajdúshamshon. Until her mid-teens, she lived surrounded by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Her entire family lived within walking distance of each other. Her parents were Honey Wertheimer and David Petrover. She had two sisters, Margit and Olga. She also had two brothers, Avram and Yenu. In 1938, when my mother was just 16 years old, the Hungarian government passed laws restricting Jewish participation in ordinary day-to-day life. Jews were forbidden to participate in most professions. Jewish children were not allowed to attend public schools. Jews were forced to abandon their homes. My mother's family was forced from their home in Heideshamschen and moved to the city of Niedertasse. Sometime in early 1943, my grandfather's sister Rose began to bombard my grandfather with letters, begging him to get the family out of Europe. She lived in New York and had already begun the process of getting everyone to safety. His response was no. He believed the family was safe and that the war would be over long before the Nazis turned their attention to Hungary. My parents had been living in Budapest, and by that time, my father had already been drafted, and I use that term loosely, into a forced labor camp. My mother was alone and very frightened. At first, wives were permitted to visit their husbands, and in the fall of 1943, my mother learned that she was pregnant. She was no longer permitted to visit my father, so she left their Budapest apartment and moved in with her parents in Niedertasse. On March 19, 1944, Nazis occupied the town. By April 17th, they completed the construction of the ghetto. A wall topped with barbed wire encircled the entire Jewish neighborhood. Jews from all the surrounding towns were herded into the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed. I was 1 day old. My grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, so all of my mother's female relatives and their children were moved into the house. There were only 123 houses for over 17,000 Jews in that ghetto. I can well imagine how many others were in my grandparents' home. Within a couple of days, my grandfather was dragged from the home and was never seen again. Family members in the house included my grandmother, great-grandmother, and 2 aunts. There were also 4 children, me and 3 little cousins, 9-year-old Mickey, 7-year-old Imre, and 2.5-year-old Zsuzsi. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth, he somehow managed to escape from the labor camp and headed straight to Niedertasse. The Nazis required that all Jews be imprisoned in a ghetto closest to their official address. My father had papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. The Jews in Budapest had not yet been rounded up, and he knew he could buy time if he could get us there. I was just a few days old when he arrived. He immediately went to the office of the authorities, and in Hungary, that was the Arrow Cross, a segment of the Hungarian military that was more than happy to help the Nazis. My father presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. The details of how he managed to get permission to take us to Budapest were never clear to me. All I know from what my mother told me is that he received the required pass when I was just over a week old. Knowing that as an escapee he was being hunted and afraid to be with us in case he was discovered with us, my father returned to the labor camp immediately after getting us to Budapest. He was murdered on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camp. My mother's 19-year-old sister Olga somehow was able to slip out of the ghetto when my father got my mother and me out. She also headed straight to Budapest. When they reached the city, my mother and Olga were able to obtain Christian identity papers. They got an apartment and lived quietly and safely for 2 months as 2 Christian women. In early May, everyone who remained in my grandparents' home were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. When the cattle cars were unloaded at Auschwitz, a life or death decision was made immediately by the presiding SS officer. A person's answer to the simple questions, how old, healthy or ill, determined whether you would live or die. The elderly, too young to work or ill, were sent immediately to the gas chamber. If you were clutching a child who was too young to work, you were sent to the gas chamber with the child. No questions were asked. No one grabbed a child away from its mother. That would cause panic, and panic was to be avoided at all costs. My mother's older sister Margit and sister-in-law Clara were the only ones who survived the initial selection. Jewish prisoners who were forced to help unload the cattle cars tried to save the lives of the young mothers by urging them to hand their children over to elderly people. They knew that if these mothers reached the front of the selection line holding their children, they would be sent with the children to the gas chamber. At the urging of the Jewish prisoners, Margit and Clara handed the 3 children to my grandmother. On that very day, my great-grandmother, grandmother, and 3 little cousins were murdered in the gas chamber. I can't imagine what my grandmother's last moments must have been like in the gas chamber with her 3 little grandchildren. In Budapest, my mother and her teenage sister Olga were living in relative safety. My mother stayed in the apartment with me while Olga went out for food. On July 5th, 1944, Olga left the apartment. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby Arrow Cross soldiers immediately ran in her direction. Olga turned and ran back into the building with the soldiers close behind. She must have realized that she had very few options, or none at all, that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me hiding in the apartment. So she made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on a Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944. My mother and I were never discovered. My mother immediately left the apartment, went into hiding, and was never willing to tell me anything more about how we survived. It wasn't until after the war that my mother learned how her older sister Margit died. Clara, her sister-in-law, survived and was with Margit on the day that she was murdered. Margit survived until the very end, working in the kitchens of Auschwitz. On the day of liberation, on the very day that the Allies entered Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, many of the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from the Allies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margit was killed on the day of liberation. So that's the story of the murder of my father and of my mother's entire family. However, that's not the end of my story. As a result of the brutal murder of her entire family and all that she had witnessed, my mother suffered from what would now be called severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But PTSD wasn't recognized until after the Vietnam War. I didn't know what a normal childhood was supposed to look like. I had no idea how my mother's lifelong trauma affected me. I did know that my childhood was hell. She was my only parent. She needed me to be the center of her existence, and she needed to see herself as the center of my existence. I think I knew there was something wrong because I saw how other parents treated their children and how different my life was from other kids. But I had no one to go to for a reality check. From my earliest memories until well into my 40s, I had no skills to see myself as a separate human being with any sort of life outside of being everything my mother needed me to be. Sometime after the war ended, my mother's Aunt Rose discovered that we had survived. We were living in Budapest. In the chaos of post-war Europe, no one knew who was dead or alive. My mother believed that anyone looking for her would be looking in Budapest. Aunt Rose began the process of getting us to the United States and urged my mother to leave Hungary as soon as possible. She refused. It took her over 2 years to accept the fact that she and I were the only survivors. So she finally agreed to leave Hungary. But by this time, everything had changed. Hungary was now a communist country, and it was almost impossible to get out. Aunt Rose arranged for a distant cousin who was a United States citizen to fly to Hungary, marry my mother, and take her to the United States. There was just one catch. She couldn't leave with me. She would have to temporarily leave me with a couple she had known for just a short time. She finally agreed. She married the distant cousin and left for America. This picture is of my mother carrying me as she headed to the train station. Fortunately, she had appointed an old family friend with good connections as my guardian, because immediately after she left Hungary, this trusted couple disappeared with me. They were unable to have children of their own and decided they'd keep me. Shortly after arriving in the United States, my mother received a telegram from my guardian. It said that the couple had disappeared. He urged her to stay put and promised that he would find me. 6 months later, she received another telegram. I had been found, and I was on my way to the United States. Here I am with my guardian shortly after he found me. And this slide also shows the Pan Am flight manifest dated July 19th, 1948, with my name highlighted. My mother's marriage was supposed to just get her out of Hungary, but somehow the distant cousin convinced her to try to make it a real marriage. I guess he seemed nice enough because she agreed, but that was a huge mistake. Within 2 years, he became very violent. I remember coming home from kindergarten and finding her lying beaten on the living room floor. Shortly after that, we escaped in a desperate run while he was at work. And that was the beginning of many unsettling and frightening incidents that defined my life for decades. Because my mother was always the center of my life, much of the chaos was due to the emotional damage that she had suffered. But some of it was self-inflicted chaos due to my own issues. Our escape marked the beginning of my journey through 9 different elementary schools, and that had a huge impact on my life. I was always the new kid on the block, and I had a very difficult time making friends. When I was 7, she married my stepfather. By the time I was 10, I had 2 new brothers. But my relationship with my stepfather wasn't good. I was a mess. I didn't know how long I'd live in any one neighborhood. Making friends quickly was a top priority. So I developed the habit of lying to make myself stand out, and that backfired many times and always made things worse. My mother's relationship with my stepfather deteriorated rapidly after my brothers were born. I hated being home. I wanted out. I needed a Prince Charming. Bill was the son of my mother's best friend from our first days in America. I had known him since I was 4 and he was 8. My first crush on him was when I was 10, and every time our families got together for a special occasion, my crush intensified. We started dating when I was 16 and married 3 years later. We'll soon be celebrating our 62nd anniversary. Finally, after getting married and moving out on my own, I thought that I was leaving all my troubles behind. What I didn't know back then is when you're part of the problem, you take your troubles with you wherever you go. Nothing about me had changed, and nothing about my mother had changed. In spite of the fact that I was now a married woman, she still needed to be the center of my universe. My husband, friends, everyone else had to be a distant second. I eventually realized that I just couldn't do it any longer. Not knowing what else to do, we moved from the New York area to Maryland. But having divorced my stepfather by then, my mother quickly followed. As soon as we bought our first house, she purchased a house just a block away. Over those next few years, we adopted 2 baby boys, but even those incredibly blessed events turned out to be filled with their own unique challenges. Our first baby was born to a mother who was on drugs and alcohol throughout her pregnancy. Early on, he exhibited serious behavioral challenges, including lifelong severe ADHD. Within months after he was placed with us, Bill became critically ill. He was eventually diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and remained seriously ill for 10 years. Our second baby was born on the Navajo reservation. Before he was placed with us, he spent 3 months in a foster home, and during that entire time, he was never held or cuddled. He suffered from failure to bond syndrome and suffered from alcohol and drug addiction from the time he was 16. However, in spite of all that, our life in Maryland was about as good as my life had ever been up to that point. Although my mother had a house a block away from us, she also had an apartment in New Jersey and spent most of her time there. So I have many wonderful memories of our early years as parents. Then in 1979, my lifelong need for family caused us to completely uproot everything. I was very close to my two brothers. From the time they were born, I was mini mom. They both decided to go to college in California, found the women of their dreams, married, and settled permanently on the West Coast. They missed me. I missed them. They started a campaign to get us to move west. They had no trouble convincing me, and I had no trouble convincing Bill. We sold our home. My mother sold her home and gave up her New Jersey apartment, and we all moved to California. Expectations were high. Expectations were not met. Everything fell apart rapidly. Now we were all together in one place, and my mother needed each one of us to make her the center of our individual universe. Constant battles started almost immediately. Also, Bill had walked away from a very successful business in Maryland, and he couldn't get it going in California. He fell into a deep depression that lasted for years. And oh, one more thing. My two young sons discovered drugs very soon after we arrived in the Golden State. Nothing was going right. One of my brothers even moved away from Southern California just a year after we arrived. All of our lives were in an uproar. I spent years having hateful thoughts about everyone in my family. In the midst of all the chaos, there was one more upheaval on the horizon. By 1987, 8 years after we arrived in California, both of our teenage sons were heavily into drugs. We were doing everything we could think of to get help for them. 12-step meetings, rehab, whatever felt as if it might save them, and nothing was working. Then one day, our 16-year-old son announced that his girlfriend was pregnant. I was literally at the end of my rope. His girlfriend told us that she was going to put the baby up for adoption, and I felt a huge sense of relief. That was one problem that would go away quickly. My son desperately wanted to see the baby before the adopting couple arrived to pick her up, so we agreed to take him to the hospital. It literally took a split second for all of us to fall in love, and my heart broke. But during that visit, our son's girlfriend had a change of heart. She decided to keep the baby. And in just a moment, I'll tell you how that story turned out. But because I can't even talk about her without smiling, you already know. My life was still filled with rage and depression. The anger and resentment that I had developed for everyone around me was literally eating me alive. And I still had several years of despair and depression ahead of me. Then one fateful day, I heard someone say these words: "You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your two ears." Those were simple words, but something miraculous happened to me at that moment. For the first time in my life, I thought that perhaps my happiness or lack of happiness just might be a choice. Maybe I could find joy in my day. It was always very easy to see only the bad. But maybe I could seek what was good. Did I even have the capacity to be happy? I had no idea. I was drowning in depression, and I knew that my life depended on finding a different path. A friend convinced me to start writing a gratitude list. There was one shining gem in my life that topped that list every day. And that was the miracle of having Kim, our precious granddaughter, and her mom in our lives. Over the years, her mom had become like a daughter to us, and Kim, who wound up being our only grandchild, was the center of our universe. That daily gratitude list helped me focus on the blessings that really mattered. Another friend suggested that I take long walks and start literally smelling the roses. So I did. I smelled the roses in just about every yard I passed, and I'm sure I looked pretty goofy to my neighbors. I reminded myself to listen to the birds, notice beautiful cloud formations, just appreciate all the beauty that God had created. And that helped calm the rage in my head. I had been a screamer my entire adult life. Like my mother, nothing ever met my expectations. I needed to change that. I stopped myself from screaming the moment I realized that I was out of control. If necessary, I stopped my awful words in mid-sentence. I felt as if I hated everyone in my family, and I knew I had to find a way to change that. There were people in my life that I wanted to love, and that became another daily list, reminding myself to seek out every good thing about my family every day. Hateful thoughts popped into my head on a regular basis, and the worst times were when I was driving. So every time I got into the car, I turned on 50s music, my favorite, and sang loudly. You can't have random thoughts when you're singing. I had been programmed by nurture to see only what was bad in my life, but I was astonished to realize I had the capacity to see what was good. I just had to learn how to tap into it. It took several years for me to overwrite the program in my head. I clearly remember the day that I realized I was no longer working at it. What I desperately wanted was starting to come naturally. Every relationship in my family changed. My brothers became, and still are, my best friends. My relationship with my mother changed, not because she changed. That was sadly not possible for her, but because I learned to set boundaries. So much changed in my head that I became convinced that life would be perfect for the rest of eternity. However, two events challenged that belief in different but very profound ways. Our precious granddaughter married a wonderful guy. They had 3 boys and eventually moved within walking distance of our California home. I was on cloud 9, but it didn't last. Several years ago, Kim's husband received a terrific career opportunity in Springfield, Missouri. They moved, and although I didn't admit it to them, my world fell apart. But just 3 years later, they convinced Bill and me to move to Missouri. They wanted us to live near them. We said yes, and that was the beginning of the happiest chapter of my life. But the blow we received in 2023 took me closer to the brink of despair than anything, since I had worked so hard to find happiness. Alcoholism finally took our son, Kim's father. One more time, I had to return to daily gratitude lists. But now I was a different person, and it was easy to find all that was good in my life. I still remind myself every day that my greatest joy comes from the gift that he gave us. Kim and her family live just 5 minutes from us. She drives me to every speaking engagement that's more than an hour drive from my house. Her wonderful husband, Josh, accompanied me to Jackson Hole, Wyoming last year for a 4-day speaking engagement. Bill and I have rotating play dates every week with our 3 great grandsons. These wonderful twilight years of my life are happier than I can even describe. And I owe it all to those magic words that I heard so many years ago. Those words opened the door to a complete change in how I saw myself and the world around me. So here's one last reminder in case anybody needs to hear it. You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you do have complete control over everything that happens between your two ears. And that's the end of my story, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing your story with us today. And those of you who have questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we already have a few right now. The first question we have is, was there a situation in which someone could have helped you or your mother along the way, but they did not do so? And if so, what could anyone have done to help you and your mother?
I'm not sure whether the person asking the question is referring to during the war or
During the war,
after.
yes.
During the war, I'm not aware of anything that anyone could have done to help. By the time the Nazis turned their attention to Hungary, uh, they had a very efficient killing machine, and it was very difficult for people to escape that. Um, the the Christian papers that my mother and Aunt Olga received probably were received by one of the diplomats, like Raoul Wallenberg, who there were several diplomats in Budapest at the time trying to save Jews, but I'm not aware of anybody that specifically could have helped my mother.
Thank you. Did your mother ever find peace or at least some sort of level of calm?
Not that I'm aware of. She did have moments of joy when my brothers started having their kids. She absolutely adored their children, and I saw happiness in her eyes and on her face when she was with them. Um, but my relationship with her didn't change at all.
You. Do you remember the couple who had disappeared with you, and do you know anything about how how you were found afterwards?
I do remember them. I had no fear at all because I'm sure when my mother left, she must have reassured me that I was only going to be left there for a while and then eventually I would join her because I don't remember having any fear. I remember they were very kind to me. Um, I remember a trip to the zoo, and also I remember my fourth birthday and the little chocolate cake that they gave me for that. Um, but I don't know how I was found. I have no recollection of my guardian, even though I have that picture of him walking with me. Um, I remember the trip to the United States, but I have no recollection of of being found and how that started.
Do you know if they were arrested for kidnapping you?
As far as I know, no. I don't think anything was done to prosecute them.
Does religion play a role in your life, or has it throughout the years?
Religion plays a very important role in my life now. Over the years, my relationship with both Judaism and God was very much a roller coaster. Because of my family history, I went through every possible iteration of a relationship with God, from not believing in God to believing that God was dead, believing that God didn't care. It was all over the map. Today, I have a very complete belief in God, total belief in God, and religion is a very important part of my life. Springfield has two different synagogues, and my husband and I belong to both, and we're very involved.
Thank you. Did you travel to the United States by yourself or with this guardian?
I traveled not with that guardian. There was another couple. As a matter of fact, the manifest that I found from the Pan Am flight has the name of the family that I traveled with. I don't remember them at all. It was a husband and wife and their child. And I guess it was my guardian who arranged for me to travel with them.
What did you do to create boundaries with your mother, knowing that trauma travels through generations?
Um, what I did to create the boundaries was to have to stand up to her demands. I guess probably the best example I can give, and I want to first say before I even tell you this brief story, is that I've been asked several times by students when I speak at schools. The students have actually used the word, "Did you forgive your mother?" And my answer to that is there was nothing to forgive. I never blamed her. As a young child, I'm sure I didn't know what was going on, but I remember very early on, probably in my teenage years, starting to understand when it really sunk in that she had lost her entire family. And when I started thinking in terms of, how would I survive that? Um, so there, she couldn't help. She really could not help herself. So in terms of, so the short story I have in terms of setting boundaries, because she did need to feel that she was the center of my life. And I remember one time when we were living in California already, and my granddaughter and I had plans to do something. My granddaughter was about 11 years old, and she said, why don't you ask Nana to come with us? And I said, sure. And I called my mother, and my mother's response was, does she always have to come places with us? And I had to tell her very firmly that um, that Kimberly, my granddaughter, was at the top of my priority list, and that she needed to accept that. And that was how I began to set boundaries.
Thank you for sharing that. Have you connected with other survivors throughout the years?
I've met many survivors over the years. When I was growing up, a lot of the communities that we lived in had a lot of survivors. Um, a few years ago, I participated in the March of the Living twice. That's a worldwide program that takes survivors and high school seniors to Poland to visit the concentration camps, Auschwitz, and the mass graves. And of course, there were other survivors on that trip. So I have met many survivors. I've never had any survivor friends.
Thank you. And also, just to quickly add to that, Holocaust Museum LA sends an adult delegation on the March of the Living every year. So if you're interested in that, you can actually look on our website or reach out to me for more information. Thank you for sharing that. The next question is, have you ever done DNA testing to see if you have distant relatives?
Yes. Yeah, I've done DNA testing with 23andMe and also Ancestry. And I did find some third or fourth cousins on actually all three on my father's side. Well, my father's side, I had met cousins that survived, but I didn't meet them until I was an adult. But on my mother's side, I did find some distant relatives on both the maternal and paternal side, and that was very exciting.
Thank you. And we have a comment here from a family saying, your story is a powerful one, and we have appreciated the opportunity to learn from it. And the question is, to what extent have you shared it with your family, your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and at what point in their lives did you start talking about it to them?
I would have to answer that by saying when people ask me, when did my mother start telling me the story? My answer is I have no recollection. I think always knew it. That question came up once when I was in a school and my granddaughter had taken me to that event. And a student asked, when did you start telling your granddaughter? And I turned to her and I said, Kim, when do you remember me starting to tell you? And her answer was, I have no recollection of you ever starting because I just always knew. So I think everyone in our family has always known. Kimberly, of course, has heard my story many times because she's come with me. My brothers, uh, on a formal level, I think this may be the second time they're hearing me because I believe they are on this webinar. They came to the Los Angeles Museum once when I first started speaking there, but we talk about this a lot. So and I'm sure their children have also heard all of it.
You and is did you also you mentioned that your mother always spoke about this. Did she ever speak to you about your father?
Very little. Um, my mother never volunteered any information about the Holocaust or her life before the Holocaust. The information that I have is entirely the result of questions that I asked her. She was always willing to answer all my questions, but my information is limited to the questions that I thought to ask her. And of course, since I started speaking and hearing a lot of the questions that I'm asked, I wish I had asked her 1,000 more questions. She told me very little about my father, other than I remember that she told me that when they met, they were married within 2 months after they met. And she told me that when they met, he was actually living with another young woman and they were engaged to get married. And apparently, he fell so madly in love with my mother, he immediately broke off the engagement, and the rest is history. Um, the only other thing I know about my father, and that wasn't so much from my mother, but from cousins who knew him and who I met after I was an adult, turned out I had a few cousins that remembered him, and they all told me that whenever he came to their homes to visit, he always had gifts for them, and that he loved children, which made it much more difficult for me to accept the fact that I never had him as a dad.
And were these cousins on his side?
Yes, ironically, my father and his youngest brother were the only two um, of many siblings, the only two that died in the Holocaust. When my mother and I first came to the United States, we had a very brief relationship with several of my father's brothers and their wives and children. But for some reason that's completely unknown to me, they drifted out of our lives very shortly after that. So I did not have anybody in my father's family in my life until I became an adult and started seeking out some of them. And there was one sister of my father who lived in California, and I didn't meet her until my husband and I and sons moved to California.
Ew. When you were growing up in the United States, did you speak about your background to anyone at school or anyone in your neighborhood? And if so, how was that? How were they able to relate to you on that level, if you did?
I absolutely did. And that was part of one of the tactics that I used to make myself stand out so I could make friends. I actually used it as an attention getter. And it did work. But yes, everybody in school, my teachers knew that I was a Holocaust survivor.
Did you or your mother experience anti-Semitism in the United States, or to what extent?
I have no recollection of experiencing any anti-Semitism until after I was married and we moved to Maryland. That was the first time that I experienced real anti-Semitism. Back in those days when I was growing up, and we're talking the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, early 1960s, people tended to live in ethnic neighborhoods. There were Italian neighborhoods, there were Jewish neighborhoods, or Irish neighborhoods. We tended to live in Jewish neighborhoods. So most of my neighbors were Jewish, most of the kids I went to school with. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, um, for the first couple of years that I was in high school, I remember specifically that for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which were like most holy of days for us, the schools were closed because so many of the students and teachers were Jewish. So I had no opportunity to experience anti-Semitism until, as I said, we moved to Maryland.
Have you been back to Hungary?
Yes, several times. The first time I went back was with my mother, and that was supposed to be several days. She was supposed to take me to a lot of different places that were part of her life. I think we only stayed maybe 2 days because it became very difficult for her. I went back just to Budapest a couple of times with rabbis of synagogues that we belonged to who took congregants, led tours of Eastern Europe with congregants. But the most wonderful trip back to Hungary was probably about 8 years ago with one of my brothers and his wife, and me and my husband. And by that time, my research had given me the address of the house where my mother was born, the address of the house where I was born, even the address of the building that my mother and Aunt Olga lived in when they were in hiding. And the cemetery where my Aunt Olga is buried and where my father is buried in a mass grave. And we hired a tour guide who could speak fluent English and Hungarian, gave him all this information. And the four of us went on the most amazing tour of my mother's life. And that was, I mean, I can't even describe. When I stood at the mass grave that my father is buried in, probably the most emotional moment of any time that I was in Hungary.
Thank you. And this was about 8 years ago.
I think it was about 8 years ago. I think that brother is watching this, but if he could perhaps type it in, but I think it was about 8 years ago.
Do you and your brothers speak Hungarian?
No, my mother never, as a matter of fact, as soon as I started learning English, I was 4 years old when I came to the United States. And so as a 4 year old, I started learning English very quickly. And as soon as that happened, my mother, who was very anxious to learn English, refused to let me speak Hungarian to her. She insisted that I speak only English to her. So I did, and as a result, I completely forgot Hungarian. So yeah, she did speak English, Hungarian in front of us to her friends and, Hungarian, anybody that was Hungarian, but none of us understood any of it.
You. Um, when did your mother pass away?
in 2006.
And when you mentioned that you asked her questions, did you ever do any recordings of her?
Yes, I did. I have, I think about six. Yeah, I think it's about six DVDs of interviews that I did with her. I was following a format from a book, so I didn't really, unfortunately, I did not use original questions. That particular thing was done strictly from a format of a book of interviewing your parent to get their whole life story. Unfortunately, she did not live long enough for us to finish it, but I have about six DVDs of that.
You. I want to thank everyone so much again for joining our program today. And Erica, to conclude, what is the most important thing that you would like our audience to take away from learning your family story today?
I love when I'm asked that question, and I'm asked it a lot in school too. What should we know? And my answer has nothing to do with the events of the Holocaust. Um, there's lots of information about the Holocaust, what happened, and all that. What is not being taught, and when I say this at a school, I usually get lots of nods from the teachers. What's not being taught is how it started. How did country after country of ordinary human beings find it so easy to turn their back on millions of people being murdered? And the answer is simple. It was lies, propaganda. In Germany, there were posters all over Germany depicting Jews as rats. And people just, it got to the point where Jews were just dehumanized. And I think that's the most important thing that people need to study and learn because I see, and I'm not pointing fingers at any one side because everybody's doing it to everybody and we all know it. We are just hating each other because we're different. Um, whether, regardless of what the difference is, we're not sitting down and talking. We're believing everything we're being told. So people need to understand how the Holocaust could happen and how people can hate each other so much or dehumanize each other so much that they just really don't care whether those people live or die. I think that's the most important lesson of the Holocaust that we need to look at now.
Want to thank you so much for speaking, and we have several comments here. People have been typing in thank you and heartfelt thanks for the opportunity to learn from this meaningful program. Erica, we appreciate you so much and everything you've done for our community by speaking and sharing this story, especially to young students on such a regular basis. So I want to just thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much again to Sherilyn King, our ASL interpreter, for being with us this afternoon. And please follow our website for more virtual programs. 2 weeks from today, on Sunday, November 9th, we'll have Mike Wolf speaking. He is a survivor from Germany. And we hope to have you tune in then. And again, just please follow all of our events. We hope to see everyone online and in person at various venues. And of course, next year, we hope to welcome everyone to our new space. And Erica, we hope the next time you're back here will be after June, or either way, we would love to have you come to our new space at some point.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Thank
again
you.
so much and wishing everybody a good day ahead.